Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Here's with some sad news to report on the passing of famous wrestler uh, Khosrow Hussein Khosrow Ali Vaziri, aka the Iron Sheik, the man who was perhaps most famous and most instrumental in the initial boom period, other than Hulk Hogan, of the World Wrestling Federation. Because as we know in professional wrestling, the babyface is only as good as the heel that he's working with. And Hulk Hogan might have not have been as hot, it might have not have been as on fire, it might have not have been as influential as he ultimately was were it not for the Iron Sheik. Because we've rewind back to the year 1983. It was the Iron Sheik who successfully defeated Bob Backlund in Madison Square Garden with the camel clutch, becoming the transitional champion from Bob Backlund, who was the face of the company from the time he won the title in 1978, from the man that we just paid tribute to, superstar Billy Graham, to this to 1983. And they wanted to switch gears and they wanted to put the belt on somebody else, somebody different, but they needed a heel transitional champion. And the Iron Sheik served that role. So had the Iron Sheik not had the heat that he not had the hatred that he had that was exhibited by the fans because of his Middle Eastern gimmick, a gimmick that he didn't invent. It existed before him. It existed with the original Sheik Ed Farhat, especially in in the New York territory in the mid '60s, but especially in Ed Farhat's own territory in Detroit. But the difference with the Iron Sheik's gimmick was the timing. At this time, it was the early 1980s. Um, to rewind back a little bit, the Iron Sheik was in the Olympics. He tried out for the Iranian Olympic team. Iran was where he was born. He was born in March 15th, 1942, in Tehran, Iran. He was from a fairly secular Shia Muslim family. At that time, Iran's religious composition was much more different, although they were Shia Muslims, like we talked about in other videos, the rise of Shia Islam under the Safavids in the 15th century. Um, they were Shias, but before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, they were not as religious. The Iranian regime had begun to move Iran into a very secular um, political makeup, unlike it is today, unlike it became. So it was under this environment that the Iron Sheik became, started to um, study wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling specifically, and he began to idolize a man named Golem um, Reza Takti, a famous wrestler. Now, Golem Reza Takti at this time had very pro-communist and socialist leanings. And as we talked about in other videos in the archives, the United States and Great Britain were involved in a coup to overthrow the socialist leader Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s and install their own puppet government in Mohammad Reza Shah, the Shah of Iran. So, being as though this guy, Ghulam Reza Takti, was a political adversary of the Shah's regime, he was murdered. Now, the Iron Sheik was training with him. The Iron Sheik was his student. The Iron Sheik idolized this man. So, when he saw this happening and he saw this political sea change, although he did work briefly as a bodyguard for the Shah of Iran because he failed to get into the Olympics in 1978. But when he saw this sea change happening and he saw the opposition to the Shah, he didn't want to be a sacrificial lamb to another political sea change when the Islamists and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini took over in the 70s. So before this even happened, before the Iranian Revolution even happened, um, the Iron Sheik was out of the country, and he's continued to wrestle, and he even became uh, the coach for the American Olympic team in 1972. And it was here when he was the coach for the American Olympic team that he caught the eye of Vern Gagne. Vern Gagne, of course, the wrestling promoter out of the Minnesota territory, also known as the American Wrestling Alliance. Vern was a collegiate wrestler himself in the 1948 Olympics. He almost made it, but since his discipline was Greco-Roman wrestling and the American wrestling team only participated, he being Vern, the American wrestling team only participated in freestyle wrestling. At that point, he did not make it. And he got into professional wrestling, and of course, in 1960, started his own wrestling promotion. But the point is, Vern was always watching out for collegiate athletes. He got Ken Patera into wrestling, and Billy Robinson, and a lot of other collegiate style athletes, and especially collegiate style wrestling. That was the credentials of the AWA. That was what differentiated the AWA style from the NWA style, which was like brawling, and the WWF style, which was more of the big man, ethnic babyface style. In the AWA, they were more real wrestlers, more grappling based. So, of course, being as though Sheik worked with the American wrestling team and he had those real wrestling shooter credentials, he caught the eye of Vern Gagne, and Vern wanted to bring him in as a wrestling coach for his camp. So the Iron Sheik was instrumental in training the likes of Jumping Jim Bronzell, training the likes of the Nature Boy Ric Flair, and training the likes of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Because when Billy Robinson, who was his former shooter and Vern's former enforcer, aka policeman, because the word policeman was used as like a word for wrestlers that would keep um, other other members of the troop of wrestlers in line in case they went off script. These guys would know legitimate wrestling holds, legitimate wrestling combinations, and legitimate wrestling maneuvers to say, hey, you don't want to follow along with the script that the book and the promoter has laid out for you. We're gonna flip the script on you, and we're actually gonna beat your ass. You know what I'm saying? And Billy Robinson served that role in the AWA for years, but now Billy was retiring, so Vern wanted a new enforcer, and that's when he hired Khosrow Vaziri, aka the Sheik. So now the Sheik is in the AWA, and he's doing pretty well as a trainer, as a coach, but he's a baby face. He wants to get over in a different way. So, of course, now flash forward to Iran. The Iranian Revolution happens. They storm the embassy. They hold the they hold the American hostages for a number of days. The Ben Affleck movie Argo is basically about this incident, and Iran becomes the first Islamic republic in history. Because keep in mind, there were other Islamic regimes in the Middle East, but they're not republics. Most of them are like Saudi Arabia, and they're monarchies. So this event is a disaster, an international disaster, and it even results in the worst the worst election loss for the Democrats in modern times in 1980 when Jimmy Carter gets trounced in that election to Ronald Reagan. It's still something that people still talk about today, especially since Iran is one of our political adversaries, a member of the quote unquote axis of evil, as President George Bush termed it. So this is something new in Iran, and Americans are seeing this on the news every single day. on on TV. You know, seeing pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, seeing pictures of Iranians burning American flags in the street, calling America the Great Satan. So obviously, and also threatening the life of Salman Rushdie, a guy who wrote a book on the Satanic verses, a series of verses revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, that were yeah, David Lee, that were contradictory to the Islamic faith, and calling for the death of this author, Salman Rushdie. So Americans are very against Iran at this time. There's a lot of heat, as it would be termed in wrestling parlance, against Iran. So the Iron Sheik switches his gimmick from this Olympic style babyface to this heel Middle Eastern character. And differently than the original Sheik was more like a hardcore type wrestler, real blood and guts type, you know, um, one of the originators of the hardcore style, but he really didn't go to the anti-American thing. It was the Iron Sheik, because of the current events that I just talked about, that really went to the anti-American thing. He would come out with the Iranian flag. He also used the curly toe boots and the keffiyeh and all those type of outer appearances, the outer accoutrements of the Middle Eastern wrestler, but he didn't go the hardcore route like the original Sheik or Wild Bill Curry had before him. He went more to the anti-American thing. It was one of the first to really do that from the Middle Eastern. Uh, uh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Satanic verses are from 1988. They aren't from 79. I'm getting the timelines a little mixed up. Not really mixed up, David Lee Rath. I'm just like, glossing over, trying to give people the idea of what was going on as far as the heat, the anti-Iranian heat that the Iron Sheik capitalized on to make his gimmick, uh, um, resonate with the people, and how much heat he had, and the fact that it was basically him who uh, who was the heel that ushered in this wave of Hulkamania in the WWF. But anyway, so right, the Iranian, exactly. That's what I brought up. Yeah, the Iranian hostage situation. It was tremendous. He had been in the WWF prior to that, though. He was in the WWF in around that time, but prior to his second run, he was in the WWF in the late '70s, where he wrestled under the name of the Great Hussein Arab, and he would use the Persian clubs, but and he wrestled like a couple of matches. I think with Cheap J Strongbow, he had like a 30-man over the top battle royal, and he wrestled Bob Backlund to like a 30-minute draw um, in the Garden, but he didn't really have the heat until he came back, and he really perfected it in Jim Crockett Promotions. Was where he really perfected um, the anti-American thing, and then Vince Jr. brought him back to beat Bob Backlund in '83, and then um, be the transitional champion uh, that Hulk Hogan defeated and beat. And like David Lee Rath is saying, the heat was just over the top. Like it took a heel like him to usher in uh, the greatest momentum that the WWF ever had. You know, it couldn't have been anybody else. Nobody had that heat that he had. And the story that we all know about is Vern Gagne, his coach, his mentor, offering him. money to break Hulk Hogan's leg in the match in a shoot, and him refusing to do so. That Vern wanted to sabotage Hogan because, of course, Hogan left Vern to go to Vince. We all know about this because of various reasons. One, Vern did not wanting to put the belt on Hogan and take it off Bockwinkel, and also Vern also wanting a piece of Hogan's merch and a piece of Hulk Hogan's Japan money. So Vern being bitter, he wanted the Iron Sheik to break Hulk Hogan's leg in this match and sabotage the plans that Vince had to make Hogan the face of the company. But this didn't happen, and Sheik stayed loyal to Vince, and that was instrumental, I think, in Vince bringing him back even after that run was over. From there, after he lost the title, he went on to win the tag team titles with Nikolai Volkov. He, they were both managed by Classy Freddie Blassie, and they beat the U.S. Express at the first WrestleMania, Wyndham and Rotunda. And at WrestleMania 3, we all remembered um, uh, that he and Nikolai Volkov wrestled the Killer Bees, in which he was attacked from behind by Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And Hacksaw Jim Duggan is an interesting one because that same year, the year of WrestleMania 3 in 1987, those two were caught and famously arrested for cocaine possession and both fired. And that's when they just had brought in Hacksaw Jim Duggan to feud with Sheik. They brought in Hacksaw from Mid South, and Hacksaw was having a huge push. And we really thought that Hacksaw was going to be something big in the Federation, and he really wasn't because of this incident. This was a very unique incident due to the fact that at that time it was still a heavily kayfabe era, and baby faces and heels did not really travel together. It was during the time when baby faces and heels were completely separated in promotions. And the fact that these two were caught traveling together, it was bigger than the drug incident. The drug incident was kind of glossed over because this was years before the steroid trial, years before the controversy surrounding drugs in the WWF. They said the papers seemed to make a bigger deal of the fact that these two guys that were supposed enemies on TV were traveling together than the fact that these guys were caught with cocaine, which is interesting. So Sheik was let go at that point. From there, I think he went back to WCW, which because George Scott, who initially gave him his one of his first starts in the Carolinas, was back to being the booker of WCW in the early days, and that's the story that Jim Cornette tells, that the Sheik was working, that they were paying the Sheik and he wasn't even working. They were just paying him and he was not wrestling. That's how lax WCW was and how uncaring WCW was in the early days when Jim Herd was in charge. So they brought him back for a while in WCW. It didn't really work out for him there, and that's when the Persian Gulf War happened, and they had the angle where they turned Sergeant. They brought Sergeant Slaughter back from the AWA. The AWA closed, and then during this time, Saddam Hussein engaged in his invasion of Kuwait, the first Persian Gulf War, and they had the idea to turn Sergeant Slaughter heel, and they brought the Iron Sheik back as Colonel Mustafa, along with Adnan Al-Kaisi in the Triangle of Terror with Slaughter. Now, these two guys were enemies in the mid '80s. Sergeant Slaughter with the GI, he was like the live action GI Joe, and the Iron Sheik. And now he's not the Iron. He comes back in 1991. He's not the Iron Sheik anymore. He is now Colonel Mustafa, and he's not even Iranian anymore. He is Iraqi, which is very ironic considering that Iran and Iraq all throughout the 1980s had one of the deadliest wars in all of Middle Eastern history, and and under Saddam's regime, Iran and Iraq were pretty much adversarial because of Saddam's anti-Shia policies. So making uh, the Iron Sheik Iraqi was sort of weird and sort of antithetical to who he really was, being that he was a proud Iranian. But oh well. Um, I guess the World Wrestling Federation figured the fans don't know the difference anyway, and they came up with this Colonel Mustafa thing, and they rolled this thing out all through all through the year basically, all through like the end of to the end like to Survivor Series. Even after the war was over, they faced a lot of flack for this. Um, this was one of the things in the early '90s that contributed to their decline in ratings and in popularity. Um, uh, the negative press that they received, capitalizing on a real life war, saying that Sergeant Slaughter was an Iraqi sympathizer, pictures of Saddam Hussein almost burning the American flag at the suggestion of Jesse Ventura, but Slaughter nixed it and he burned the Hulkamania shirt instead. This whole thing was just in bad taste. It caused a lot of people, a lot of celebrities that were booked for WrestleMania 7 to back out of WrestleMania 7, such as Bob Costas. It was just a whole mess. But the WWF continued course, and in um, Madison Square Garden in SummerSlam 1991, Sheik and Slaughter and Adnan Casey actually participated in a handicap match against Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. This is the one where the Ultimate Warrior demanded more money for Vince, or he wouldn't appear, and then that's when he Warrior left the company. And shortly after that, the Iron Sheik also um, left the World Wrestling Federation, and he kind of went around to different independent promotions until he returned to the company in 1996 alongside another former nemesis, Bob Backlund, as the co-manager of the Sultan, Rikishi Fatu, a member of the Samoans, the Usos' father, as many will know, portrayed a Middle Eastern type eunuch character with a mask on, indicating that he had his tongue removed or whatever, and that he was like I said, a Middle Eastern eunuch. And Bob Backlund and Iron Sheik was his manager, and they were trying to make him, trying to repackage him as a gimmick other than a Samoan savage or some kind of Samoan gangster, which he was before he became the Sultan. It was just a stupid gimmick, but he does have the distinction the Sultan does of wrestling The Rock at The Rock's first WrestleMania appearance in 1997. So obviously, we know that Sultan gimmick didn't really work out. So Sheik and Backlund were both let go, and the Iron Sheik doesn't appear on WWF TV again until 2001, WrestleMania 17, the Gimmick Battle Royal, in which the Iron Sheik becomes the winner of the Gimmick Battle Royal. And the precise reason why he becomes the winner of the Gimmick Battle Royal is because he's too old to take the bump. Uh, he's too old to take the bump off the top rope. I think it was no, my mistake. He wasn't he that won. I think it was Sergeant Slaughter that won. But anyway, it came down to him and Slaughter towards the end. The Gimmick Battle Royal was the last time that we really saw him. And towards the end of his life, like most heels, let me look that up. Oh no, I was right the first time, guys. Yeah, the Iron Sheik wins the gimmick battle royal in WrestleMania 17, and we don't really see him until he's inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2005. He went in with that class with Hulk Hogan, with Jimmy Hart, with Greg Heimer Valentine, all those individuals. And after that, after his induction into the WWE Hall of Fame, he becomes more famous for working with Howard Stern, working on the Howard Stern show, doing a lot of shoot interviews, especially with RF Video, with the famous shoot interview in 2007, where it's him, New Jack, and the Honky Talk Man, uh, with that shoot in which they all berate Chris Benoit because this was 2007. This was the time when everybody in the wrestling community was discussing the Chris Benoit incident, and they happened to ask the Iron Sheik and New Jack and Hockey Talk Man, and all three men gave the most one of the most hilarious shoot interviews that I've ever seen. To the point where New Jack and the Iron Sheik and the Hockey Talk Man, all three guys, were mooning uh, the screen and cursing out Chris Benoit like you wouldn't believe. And he became more famous for his out of the ring antics, including challenge in 2013, challenging the mayor of Toronto, Tom Ford at that time, to a match. Uh, um, and calling people jabroni, saying uh, fuck, fucking bullshit. And also uh, putting Boston Wrestling, the channel Boston Wrestling, on the map by cursing out Brian Blair. Brian Blair becomes the target of the Iron Sheik's vitriol, the target of the Iron Sheik's. Every interview, he would say, "Fuck Brian Blair, that jabroni. I fuck his ass, make him humble." And he becomes basically a caricature of his own self. Even when kayfabe commentaries later on does the his roast, that's the roast where infamously Scott Hall bust in because during that roast, because some comedian made a joke about Owen Hart's death, and during the Iron Sheik's roast, and Scott Hall comes in, he's with Jim Powers from the Young Stallions, and he starts just cursing at this comedian. That was during the Iron Sheik's roast. So it's like the Iron Sheik's gimmick took on a new life, took on a new dimension after he stepped away from the ring. No longer was he this villainous heel that everybody hated and despised. The time had passed for that. Now he was sort of a beloved uh, statesman for shoot interviews and for the Howard Stern show, putting all these shoot interview companies on the map. Like I said, Boston Wrestling with Dan Marotti before Tony Atlas was really doing it. RF video shoot where he curses basically this one RF video shoot in 2007 where he basically cursed out everybody. The one that he did by himself, he cursed out Iron Sheik, cursed out uh, basically anybody who's anybody, including his former tag team partner Nikolai Volkov, and just becomes this character that is just hilarious to watch and to imitate. And when things would go down in the wrestling community, and even outside of the wrestling community, just in celebrity culture in general, you would look for the what the Iron Sheik tweeted out. If you thought Trump's two tweets were crazy when he was president, man, you should have read some of the Iron Sheik's tweets. That Iron Sheik's tweets were even crazier than Trump's tweets. You know what I mean? So Rest in peace to the Iron Sheik. Unfortunately, he's had a lot of issues with drugs and alcohol over the years that is well documented. He had um, his daughter was unfortunately murdered. His daughter Marissa by her boyfriend in 2003. So he had those kinds of personal issues, and he just um, was one of those in a way one of those tragic figures in wrestling that we often talk about, that is more notorious in a sense for, or just as notorious for his outside of the ring antics as his inside of the ring antics. He was a great wrestler, a great scientific wrestler, probably more gimmick based, I would say, more for the gimmick and less for his in ring skill, but he had in ring skill. Obviously, he was um, an Olympic wrestler. He was an Olympic shooter, but because of the time, the time frame, and the gimmick that he chose to adopt, he became more famous for the gimmick. And it was interesting. It's interesting to see how but like I said, a beloved, a hated heel, so hated as he really was in the late '70s and early '80s because of, like David Lee Rath pointed out, the hostage crisis, becoming this beloved heel and appreciated heel for throughout all of the wrestling community. So may the Iron Sheik rest in peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Fucking bullshit, as the Iron Sheik would say. Rest in peace, Sheiky baby.